Hi everyone, welcome to our GM number 2 again. Happy week 3. Some reminders of the week. So attendance, please let your committee directors know. Again, 24 hours in advance, and you get 2 excused absences. Also, if you're not doing this already, please log your hours in terms of any shadowing work you do, for example, for PCLA, any committee work or general meeting hours like right now. Feel free to log them onto our website. And this will be a good, I guess, database for you to reference to in the future if you're applying to anything. All right, so short and sweet, I'll pass it on to education for their lovely presentation.
Yeah, so today we're just going to be talking about neuroscience and the basics of neuroscience. So I'm going to hand it off to Neha, who will be starting on our presentation today.
Okay, yeah, this is the first slide. Okay, so we're just going to start off with a little question to, if you guys can answer in the chat, or you can unmute if you'd like. So if you guys could describe neuroscience in one word, how would you, what word would you use to describe neuroscience? And you can just put something in the chat. If you'd like to unmute, you can. And already put it in the chat as well, the question. I like that, Tiffany. That's mine. Brain, learning about brain. Anyone else? Hard, yeah. Yeah. So basically what neuroscience is it's a study of the nervous system, and like Anna said, like neurons as well. So the nervous system, it's made up of the brain, the spinal cord, nerves, and the tiniest neurons. And basically what neuroscience studies is, how does the system work? How is the system developed? What can go wrong with this system? And basically all of that ties into neurological disorders that we'll be talking about later on in our presentations. And it also aims to make sense of what the biological basis behind our behavior. So basically why we do what we do, how does memory work? How does perception work? So in our presentation today, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of neuroscience, but also how interdisciplinary the field of neuroscience is and how it's a bunch of different sciences combined together, and also the different fields of neuroscience, so the different fields that you can go into with neuroscience, as well as different technological aspects of neuroscience.
Yeah, and so just to give a brief history of neuroscience, and so just as a leading question, when I say neuroscience, what kind of time period usually comes to mind? And there's no right or wrong answer. It's just whatever pops into your head. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like Tiffany said, oftentimes it can be very much like a modern thing, and it very much is like a modern field. It's definitely developing as we're learning more about just how everything works. And so there's a lot of groundbreaking stuff and a lot of stuff that we don't know. And so oftentimes it's very much swept up in new research in modern times. But there's also a lot of history to neuroscience. And so just to give a brief overview, and so the first evidence of any kind of discussion about the brain or spinal cord actually dates all the way back to ancient Egypt. And so even back in the 1700s BC, people were already thinking about thinking. And so that's kind of our first kind of delve into what the brain is, or what is neuroscience. And so we fast forward a while, and at first it's kind of less developed of a theory. And so in fact, in Aristotle's time, around 300s BC, he actually thought that our thoughts or intellect actually came from the heart rather than from the brain. But as we continue to develop throughout history, eventually we get to the early and mid 1800s, and now we have certain theories popping up. And so, for example, phrenology, which is how the shape of the skull purportedly was able to be related to behavior or other disorders. And then later, how functions were determined to be tied to specific areas of the brain. And this was known as connectivism. And so maybe you've heard of people like Broca or Wernicke in like those areas of the brain. And so that's kind of where that came from, these theories about how different parts of the brain are tied to different functions. And so this is all kind of big, macro scale stuff. But then in 1891, a man named Ramon y Cajal comes in, and he actually produces the first stained images of the neuron. And so now we can actually see, molecularly, or not molecularly, but cellularly, what the fundamental basis for the nervous system is. And so that was kind of this groundbreaking discovery back in 1891. And then we fast forward and we have more and more developments. Eventually, in 1952, we have Hodgkin and Huxley, and they were actually able to elucidate the entirety of how this action potential works, which is really the fundamental basis for the electrochemical signaling that allows for neurons to communicate and just give rise to all of the complex behavior that we can see. And so again, like we were saying, modern times, there's so many new developments rapidly happening, whether that be from neuroimaging to new brain machine interfaces. But again, it's kind of nice to just take a step back into history and see all the developments that happened for us to get here. And so now we're just going to transition a little bit into more of the careers as well as the different fields of neuroscience. And so just as a question for you all, what are your career goals? And obviously these can change and they don't need to be solid, but just right now, what are you thinking of getting into? All right, cool. Yeah. So, I mean, I see a lot of, health related clinical psychology, neurology, all of this stuff, which is really great. And then I also noticed that Daniel was interested in AI, machine learning, which is also another field of neuroscience that's very much different, but still related. And then Sai, NBA player, I respect that. But yeah, and so within neuroscience, there's just even if you don't even go into a career that's even related to neuroscience, there's still so many skills that are related that can help you in whatever career you go into. But with neuroscience, there are also many other related fields. And so again, you have your health related fields, whether that be, from physician, psychology, therapy, technology, or technicians, all this health related stuff. You also have research and education. So a lot of people in neuroscience might want to go into research or faculty teaching or just being in a lab or doing clinical research. And then you have the more quantitative fields. So big data, artificial intelligence, medical technologies, all of that stuff. But there's so many more other fields related to neuroscience, whether that be in law and policy or consulting, or just writing with scientific journals or being in journaling. There's just so many different opportunities out there. And so that's just kind of what we wanted to introduce with this slide, that there's a lot of opportunities related to neuroscience.
And next we'll be going over how neuroscience is so interdisciplinary. So basically what neuroscience is it's a bunch of different sciences combined into one, which is why a lot of people are interested in it, because it's not just biology or just one subject, it's a bunch of little subjects combined together. So obviously a big part of neuroscience is molecular biology and physiology, anatomy, because essentially in order to understand what the brain does and how it works, you need to understand what it looks like, the different structures of it, and basically how it functions and how this applies to more complex processes of the body. And all of that applies to neurological disorders that we'll be discussing later on in our presentations. And a big part of neuroscience is also psychology. So if any of you guys are psychobiology majors, it's a good mix of neuroscience, biology, and psychology all together, because a big chunk of neuroscience is understanding like what goes on in the brain that controls our behavior or when we're learning or like how we process information, which is a huge part of memory, and then how we use that information to act. And all of that is obviously going on in the brain. So it's important to understand like which parts of the brain control different parts of our behavior. And obviously there's like a lot of math in neuroscience as well, like mathematical modeling. If you've taken like LS30A or LS30B, like a lot of that is like using Python and using mathematical equations to model like processes in like physiology. So neuroscience uses a lot of that because you have to create these models in order to understand things like neuron potential and like making graphs to understand like what's going on in the brain. And obviously like computer science is a really big part of it, like the name of our club, like high tech and neurological disorders. So there's different technological aspects of the field, which we'll be talking about in more detail later on in the presentation.
Yeah, and so now we're gonna kind of switch gears and talk about some of the like basics about neuroscience. And so starting off with the nervous system, just one question I had is like, how many neurons do you think there are total, at least in the brain and the spinal cord? And yeah, just take a wild guess. We'll see who gets approximately close. $3 million, that's it. 200 million, even more, okay. 200,000, 1 billion, 300 million, 300,000, all right. So yeah, we have, looks like a lot of people have a wide variety of different responses to how many neurons you think there are. And actually, it's actually even like several times magnitude more than anybody actually guessed. In fact, there's approximately 100 billion combined, which is a lot of neurons. And so, I mean, that just goes to show how complex of a system it really is. And so overall, basically the nervous system works by again sending these electrochemical signals between neurons to transmit information. And so this can be anywhere from like sensory input to integrating all this information, like whether that be in the brain and spinal cord, and then finally sending out a motor output so that you can move and respond to different things in the environment. And so just to give a basic overview, there's these different divisions of the nervous system. And so the first division is usually between the central and the peripheral nervous system. And so the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system consists of all the other nerves that interact with that. And so from this, you can also divide it even more. And so peripheral is then divided into the autonomic and the somatic nervous systems. And so the autonomic is mainly involuntary. And so these kind of automatic controls, while the somatic is your voluntary movement, as well as your voluntary sensory information. And then finally, within the autonomic division, you also have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And you may recognize the sympathetic to be your like fight or flight response, so your activation, whereas your parasympathetic can be referred to as this your rest and digest kind of role. And then one last thing I wanted to note was that although oftentimes we talk about neurons and neurons and neurons in the nervous system, there's actually even more glial cells present in the nervous system that can play a really important role in terms of not just being a supporting structure, but even helping the role of the neurons in the nervous system.
And now we're going to go into a little bit more detail of the technological aspects of neuro and like just different types of neurotechnology. So like one important part of neurotechnology and just being able to understand how the brain works is like devices that take images of the brain and records activity that's happening in the brain. So an example of that is functional magnetic resonance imaging, so an fMRI. So you've probably heard of that. It's like a big machine that you put a patient in, and it takes images of their brain, and it uses a magnetic field, and it basically measures changes in blood flow to the brain. So you'll have like parts of the brain light up, and it shows activation of multiple brain regions, which can basically help like neurologists, physicians, neuroscientists learn and study which parts of the brain communicate with one another. So for example, you can have like someone doing like an activity or talking or thinking about something, and different parts of the brain will light up, and that helps you decide like which parts of the brain are communicating with one another during a certain activity. And we'll have pictures later on in the presentation to show you guys like actually what these scans look like. And in a similar manner, there's PET scans, which is positron emission tomography. And similarly, it creates images of the brain. And what happens is like a neuroscientist or a physician, they'll put these radio tracers into the body, or there'll be like radio tracers within your body, like naturally like proteins. And basically a PET scan will create images of the brain by tracing these radioactive molecules that are traveling throughout our body. And it basically shows like where these molecules end up. And it can kind of show like that can help like determine which part of the brain is in charge of like metabolism, which part of the brain is in charge of like regulation of our body temperature. So that's been really beneficial to like neuroscientists who are like studying which parts of the brain control like different regulatory behaviors of our body. And then in terms of like treatment of like neurological disorders, which is obviously a really big part of our club that we study, one really big part of neurotech is deep brain stimulation, or DBS. And that's basically a device that is placed in it implants electrodes, and those electrodes will send out electrical impulses, and that can help treat different parts of the brain by sending out electrical impulses. And it'll target like either specific region or specific cells or chemicals within the brain, and that can help control things like tremors, or just help promote movement, or even like prevent movement for like disorders that cause like a lot of shaking or tremors. And obviously another important part is prosthetics. So that's what like the hand innovation team at hand does. So here's a little like sketch of the prosthetic, or like the device that they've been working on. And basically it's a device to help patients with Parkinson's to help control their tremors. And that's obviously another important part of neurotech, like being able to create devices that help people control their symptoms. And the next slide. And here I just put some pictures of like the different like scans I talked about, and also the picture. So the picture on the left of the brain scans, that's usually what like an MRI looks like. So you have different parts of the brain lighting up, and MRIs are really good at like determining like if someone has like a brain tumor or something, like because of like the image is really good at showing like where tumors are, like which parts of the brain like may be enlarged, or where you have too much blood flow going. So it can help with like internal bleeding in the brain, like finding the location of that. And then the picture on the right shows a PET scan. So in a similar manner, like it basically shows different parts of the brain being lit up, which is really beneficial to like neuroscientists that are trying to like pinpoint specific locations of the brain and trying to connect it to different behaviors. And then on the bottom left is a picture of kind of like the process of this one other like device that helps treat neurological disorders. It's called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation. And it's kind of similar to fMRI, where it uses a strong magnetic field, and it creates electrical currents in your neural circuits in the brain. And basically this can help produce muscle movement. So for those who might have like a neurological disorder, like they might have like stiffness or rigidness. So this can help promote like muscle movement to help control their symptoms, and it usually goes on top of the head.
Yeah, so now we're going to transition to the next slide and talk a little bit more about the neuron. So my first question for you all is, at what point in the neuron does an electrical impulse become an action potential? So if you're to look at the little picture on the right side and you were to pick one of the main areas that has been highlighted, where do you think that that electrical impulse becomes something that is something that we can use to travel information? All right, we got axon from Daniel. Yeah, Tiffany said cell body or the axon hillock part, which would be kind of that in between the cell body and the axon. Anyone else? So yeah, exactly. So it is like the axon. So that's where the electrical impulse is transferred down, and it goes all the way through the axon and is then released through the axon terminals. My next question is, what part of the neuron contains the nucleus and the cytoplasm of the cell? So pretty simple question, but pretty important to know. Right, exactly. The cell body. So yeah, Daniel's got it, the cell body. So just like any other cell in the body, our nucleus and our cytoplasm are all stored in one place. And it's important that we have this just because it, controls what the DNA is doing, it controls what each neuron is doing, and make sure that the appropriate neurotransmitters are made and are being sent out from each neuron. So kind of going over the entire neuron, neurons are the primary functioning units of the nervous system. And as you can see on the right, that's a pretty standard picture of what a neuron is. But if you look at any other pictures, different parts of the body will have different looking neurons. So they don't all look like that, but a lot of them do. But it's interesting how, they're not all the same, even though they all do a lot of the same things. They all transmit information to other nerve cells, muscles, or gland cells. And most neurons are composed of a cell body, axon, and dendrites. So the dendrites, which are visualized in the magenta color, extend from the neuron cell body. And they're where the neurons will receive most of their information, whether it be from, environmental cues or from other neurons. And dendrite receptors allow neurons to communicate with other neurons by picking up signals through transmitters, which are just chemical molecules that are received on the dendrites. And then following that, the soma, which is the cell body, as Dan pointed out, contains the nucleus, and it takes that information from the dendrites and transmits them to the axon. And depending on how many of those neurotransmitters are in the nucleus and how much excitation is there, an electrical impulse will build, and it will become the action potential, which then moves down the axon. And that, that action potential is propagated in the myelin sheath is important in increasing the speed, but not all neurons have that. So it's important to see the differences between neurons that do have it. So slower transmission, neurons that don't have it will have slower transmission, and then neurons that do have it will have faster transmission. And when the signal reaches the axon terminals, which are in purple on the right side of that picture, the neurotransmitters are released. And so it's a constant stream of getting neurotransmitters and releasing neurotransmitters, and neurons will communicate with each other through receptors of other neurons.
And now we'll be talking a little bit about a few different diseases that will be going on into later detail about in later presentations this quarter, but we wanted to introduce them to you so you have an idea of what are neurological disorders and what causes them. So the first one is Parkinson's disease. If you were a member last year, we talked about Parkinson's a lot. But basically, as just a quick overview, Parkinson's is triggered by factors like age, hereditary factors, your sex. So males are more likely to get Parkinson's, but also exposure to toxins. So it's a progressive nervous system disorder that affects the movement, which is pretty common among like neurological disorders in general, where like movement is affected a lot. And like I mentioned, it's generally triggered by like hereditary factors, but also age. And while researchers have identified like specific genetic mutations that are linked to Parkinson's disease, there's also like environmental triggers that can increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. So that's why exposure to toxins can like sometimes like lead to Parkinson's or like increase the risk of getting Parkinson's. And most of the symptoms that patients encounter range from movement, cognitive symptoms, but also psychiatric symptoms. So there can sometimes be like memory loss where a patient might forget like some details of their like important details. Obviously movement where they might feel like muscle stiffness, but also like slowed movement. So their hands might get really stiff. So normally like when we walk with our hands like swinging by our sides. So someone with Parkinson's might not be able to do that because of the stiffness. And also decreased ability to perform automatic movements. Like when I'm talking, my hands are like moving, but someone with Parkinson's might have difficulty doing that. And also speech changes. So something that like some people with Parkinson's might experience is like muscles and like their throat and stuff that become stiff. So that actually makes it really hard for them to talk. So it's definitely like a really big change in their life. Like there have been patients with Parkinson's who used to play instruments, but obviously once they were diagnosed with Parkinson's, it was really difficult for them to do that because of speech changes. And also like sometimes they'll like slur on their words, like not being able to like complete sentences. So it definitely is like a dramatic change, and these symptoms definitely affect like lots of aspects of their life. And many of these symptoms are due to the death of dopamine neurons. So Arti, she talked about like neurons and how they communicate with one another. So dopamine neurons, those can be affected because of the different, and because of that, that can lead to like the tremors and the slowed movement. And basically research that's going on, it has proved that again, like there's different genetic mutations linked to Parkinson's. And next slide, please. And another disease that is also kind of similar to Parkinson's and has to do with like neuron death and neurons being affected is Huntington's disease. And this one is a progressive brain disorder caused by a dominant mutation in the Huntington gene. So for that, it emerges at middle age and causes a variety of symptoms, which includes chorea, which is involuntary spasmodic movements. So this one is, it has both like muscle rigidity, but also like uncontrolled movements where they might have like tremors and shaking that they're not able to control, and also losing their balance, and their memory is affected as well. So this is where cognitive symptoms come in, where their memory is affected. And also psychiatric symptoms like depression, because obviously if you're diagnosed with one of these diseases, so much of your life is being affected. And like having to adjust to those changes can lead to like depression and anxiety. And the age of onset is usually like around 40 years old. And I can do this one as well. So our last slide is about neuroscience research that's actually going on at UCLA. So this is like research going that are like in labs that are with professors here, which I think is really interesting, especially since a lot of you guys are probably interested in doing neuroscience research. So just a little question pertaining to the research. How many neurons do you think are in the brain of a fruit fly? So fruit flies are really tiny, but how many neurons do you think are in their brain? Guess it, 1 million, 10,000. Okay, those are good. So there, according to science.org, there's about 100,000 neurons in a fruit fly's brain. So you guys were, yeah, kind of off, but I get why you would think it's a lot, because we mentioned before, like there's so many neurons in like in brains, but the fruit fly has around 100,000 neurons, which is still a lot. So one like neuroscience research that's going on, that's being conducted at UCLA, was a study that's looking at how activity regulates brain development in the fly. So basically what they did was, it was a collaboration conducted by Aiken Orkun, who is an assistant professor in neurobiology, and also another professor, Dr. Lawrence, who is in the biological chemistry department. And it's basically studying how activity during brain development contributed to circuit assembly in the fly. And basically what they found out in their results was, they found evidence suggesting that circuit assembly during brain development, so that's basically like the neural circuits and how they work with one another and how they're developed, all of that, the brain development is determined through a combination of cell type specific patterns of activity. So basically, like they found like cell recognition molecules that contributed to this brain development, and that led to like current research that's being done right now, where they're trying to figure out like, where does this activity that's happening in a fruit fly come from? Where is that activity, like how is that being organized across the brain, and how can we use like these fruit flies in their brain development and apply that to humans and this human activity in general.
Awesome. Thank you again for our speakers, Neha, Sebastian, Arti, for this great first seminar presentation. All right, the last, I guess, couple minutes, we're gonna do committee breakouts. So just to, I guess, have you guys have the time to catch up or anything else. So yeah, we'll go ahead and make that now. I'll stop recording.